Welcome to one of the most talked about and mysterious stories ever to come out of Savannah, Georgia. It all began in 1839. At the time, Savannah was known as a jewel of the South, filled with tree-lined streets and grand homes. But beneath the surface, whispers and rumors moved quietly through the city, especially from the wealthy neighborhoods on Abercorn Street to the servants' quarters out back. On April 3rd, 1839, a small notice appeared in the Savannah Morning Republican. Most people barely noticed it. It simply said that a marriage license had been issued to Elizabeth Thornton, a 42-year-old widow, and James Bennett, a man of 26. What the paper didn't mention: James Bennett had only recently been enslaved on Elizabeth's own plantation. The news shocked the city. The story that unfolded would not only tear apart the Thornton family, but also expose secrets that polite society had tried to keep hidden. Elizabeth Thornton, born Elizabeth Montgomery, came from one of Georgia's oldest and richest families. Her grandfather came to the colony in 1733 with General Oglethorpe. Over the years, the Montgomerys built their fortune on rice plantations, wealth made to the labor of hundreds of enslaved people. Elizabeth grew up in luxury, living in a large home on Reynolds Square. At 17, she married Richard Thornton, a wealthy plantation owner nearly 30 years older than her. Their marriage joined two powerful families. Richard had a young son named William from a previous marriage. He was just 5 years younger than Elizabeth. A cousin named Mary Benny visited the plantation in 1826 and wrote in her journal that the household was quiet but strictly run. She said Elizabeth seemed gentle but firm with the staff. Richard, her husband, didn't speak much, and when he did, things would go completely silent. He was often away on trips, so Elizabeth ran things herself. Few people knew how close she had become with a house servant named Grace, who had arrived from Charleston in 1822. Grace came with her young son, James, who was 9 at the time. By 1835, tax records listed 47 enslaved people on the Thornton plantation. Most worked in the fields, but James Bennett was one of only a few house servants. Over time, his name showed up more and more in household documents, first as Grace's boy, then simply James, and eventually as James Bennett. Giving him a surname was unusual and has puzzled researchers ever since. One historian, Dr. Elenina Hammond, studied the Thornton papers before they mysteriously vanished in 1963. She found records showing that James was taught to read and write, a rare and remarkable thing at the time. Her notes included purchases of books, pencils, and writing slates marked for JB's instruction. When Richard Thornton died from yellow fever in 1836, he left everything to Elizabeth and gave his son William a large inheritance. One part of the will stood out. James Bennett could not be sold or transferred and was to remain employed by Elizabeth for life. After mourning for a year, Elizabeth returned to public life. Neighbors noticed the plantation was still running smoothly. But soon, people started seeing things that made them curious. A neighbor, Margaret Habersham, said she saw Elizabeth and James walking together in the garden, talking more like equals and like a mistress and a servant. A former kitchen maid, Sarah Johnson, said she once walked in on them standing very close together. James quickly stepped back, and Elizabeth looked flustered. As time passed, Elizabeth became more distant from society. She stopped going to social events. Her cousin Thomas visited in early 1838 and said she seemed happier than usual, though oddly different. He noticed she was dressed more plainly and spoke to James as if they were old friends. She looked like she had a secret, he wrote. Soon after, Elizabeth's stepson William began writing urgent letters to his uncle, Judge Henry Thornton, expressing concern about her behavior. In December 1838, William said he planned to visit the plantation without warning. Judge Henry advised him to be careful. There were rumors already spreading. William showed up on January 15, 1839, during a rainy night. The next morning, the sheriff was called about a serious disturbance. Details were never made public, but we know William left in a hurry and went straight to the authorities. James Bennett was arrested, but later released when the charges were dropped. Elizabeth wasn't arrested, but church leaders told her to stay away for a while. 6 weeks later, everything changed. The Savannah Morning Republican published a second notice. Elizabeth and James had gotten married. Somehow, she had secured freedom papers for James and held a quiet wedding inside the Thornton home. The ceremony was performed by a Methodist minister known for supporting abolition. Only a few people were present: Grace, James's mother, and a lawyer from Philadelphia named Samuel Cooper. The city's reaction was swift and harsh. The city council called an emergency meeting to deal with what they called a moral crisis. William Thornton filed legal papers, claiming Elizabeth was mentally unfit, and asked for control of the estate. Judge Henry, being a relative, stepped away from the case but wrote to the governor for help. The Montgomery family cut ties with Elizabeth completely and made public statements in newspapers across Georgia and South Carolina. After that, many official records were destroyed, apparently to erase the incident, but some clues remain. In 1954, during renovations of an old house on Broughton Street, a letter was found. The author called himself a witness to infamy and described how, on the night of April 10th, a group of 12 men rode to the Thornton estate with torches. They demanded James come out. Instead, Elizabeth appeared with a shotgun and told them to leave. Her calm but firm warning made them back off. 2 days later, the sheriff returned with more men, but the house was empty. Everything inside was carefully covered and packed. The room that had been James's study was completely cleaned out. No books, no papers, nothing. Sarah Johnson later said that Elizabeth had taught James to read and write in that room. She said they had spent many evenings there and had removed every trace of it before they vanished. Elizabeth and James's disappearance became known as the Great Savannah Mystery. The search for them was the biggest missing persons case in the county's history. Roads were watched, ports were guarded, and even private detectives were hired from New York. But no one ever confirmed seeing them again. Rumors, though, kept spreading. A train worker in Charleston said he saw a white woman and a well-dressed black man boarding a train heading north. A ship captain in Wilmington claimed he might have taken a mixed-race couple to Boston. A banker in Montreal later reported a woman who looked like Elizabeth tried to access funds using documents from that same Philadelphia lawyer, Samuel Cooper. With no answers, the scandal faded into a whispered warning, something told quietly to young women in polite circles. The Thornton estate eventually fell apart. William took full control by October 1839, sold it to a family from Virginia, and never came back to Savannah. What happened to the 46 enslaved people left behind? We can't say for sure. One record shows that at least some were sold to a plantation in Alabama. Grace, James's mother, wasn't listed among those sold when the Thornton estate changed hands. The mystery might have faded into the past, if not for what happened 5 years later. In 1844, during renovations to the old Thornton home, workers uncovered something strange beneath the floorboards of the small study. Wrapped carefully in oilcloth was a leather-bound journal. It was turned over to local authorities and eventually ended up with Judge Henry Thornton. He reportedly read the entire journal in one sitting before locking away in his personal safe. Just 3 weeks later, the judge died suddenly. Doctors said it was a stroke brought on by stress. His widow later claimed she burned the journal without reading it, calling it dangerous and corrupting. But before it was destroyed, the judge's clerk, a young man named Thomas Wilberforce, quietly copied parts of it. Years later, after moving to Boston and becoming active in anti-slavery efforts, Wilberforce shared sections of the journal with a Harvard researcher in 1861. Notes from that researcher, discovered in the Harvard archives in 1958, confirmed the journal belonged to Elizabeth Thornton. It included entries going back to 1822, the year Grace and her son James first arrived at the plantation. The early pages showed Elizabeth's growing fascination with James. She wrote, "The child is remarkably smart. Maybe I'm too curious, but there's a spark in his eyes I haven't seen in any other child, black or white." In another entry, she described showing him her pressed flower collection. He remembered all the names after hearing them just once. As time went on, the entries became more personal. She admitted to secretly teaching James to read, even though her husband had strictly forbidden it. "He'd be furious if he knew," she wrote. "But what harm is there in learning? The boy absorbs every word. She compared his love of reading to her own, before she was told that proper women should care only about manners and charm. By 1830, when James was around 17, her feelings were harder to hide. "I wait to see him in the mornings," she wrote. "I tell myself it's just pride, but I fear it's more." A few years later, just before Richard Thornton's death, she wrote of a moment where James recited poetry to her. "I no longer saw the boy I taught, but the man he's become." She sent him away and wept afterward, not fully sure why. The most revealing pages came after Richard's passing. She described late-night talks with James in the library and how, for the first time, she felt truly understood. "He sees me in a way no one ever has," she wrote. She also mentioned asking about laws in other states, places where they might live freely. The last copied entry was dated March 30th, 1839, just before their marriage announcement. "Tomorrow, everything changes," it read. Sam Cooper has the documents. After the ceremony, "We'll leave. Jay worries about his mother, but she insists on staying for now. I've sewn jewelry and money into our clothes. Friends up north have prepared safe places along the way. For the first time, I'm choosing my own life." The Harvard researcher added one more note. Wilberforce later claimed that, in 1852, while visiting Montreal, he met a woman he believed was Elizabeth Thornton. She lived under a different name in a quiet neighborhood. When he approached her, she denied being Elizabeth, but invited him in for tea. She spoke about poetry, including works by Byron, which reminded him of her journal. Before he left, he noticed a portrait on the wall of a well-dressed black man. When he asked about it, she smiled and said, "My late husband. He passed 3 years ago." Wilberforce never officially documented the meeting. Over time, public interest in the Thornton case faded. The Civil War was on the horizon, and attention shifted elsewhere. The old plantation changed owners twice before it was mostly destroyed during Sherman's march in 1864. Later, the land was developed, and today, a neighborhood stands where the house once did. Most residents have no idea what happened there. The Thornton name remains only in a small side street near Abercorn and in bits and pieces found in the Georgia Historical Society archives. In 1957, while building a shopping center near the old estate, construction workers found a small metal box buried about 3 feet underground. Inside were a cameo brooch, a dried camellia flower pressed between glass, and a folded note tied with a lock of hair. These items sat unnoticed until 1963, when Dr. Ellen Hammond studied them as part of her research into the case. She noted the cameo matched one from Elizabeth's wedding records. The flower was a rare camellia developed on the plantation. The hair appeared to be from 2 people, strands carefully twisted together. Dr. Hammond never published what she found. Those who knew her said she became obsessed, convinced more evidence was still out there. In the spring of 1963, she traveled to Montreal, chasing the Wilberforce lead. She sent a letter to her department chair claiming she had found something big, proof that would change Georgia's history. 2 weeks later, she vanished. Her hotel room was found empty. Her notes were gone. The only thing left was a single pressed camellia placed on the pillow. 3 days later, she was found in a hospital, disoriented and unable to explain what had happened. She never spoke of the case again and passed away in 1968. Today, the story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett lives somewhere between history and legend. Some parts are backed by real records, court files, letters, newspaper announcements. Other details remain guesses, built from scraps and whispers. What we know for sure is this. In 1839, a white widow and a black man she once legally owned made the bold decision to be together. They left behind a shocked community, not just because of race, but because their bond had likely started long before her husband died. They broke rules that weren't meant to be broken. The real mystery isn't just where they went, but how their relationship grew in silence. What was said in the privacy of that library? What promises were exchanged in the stillness of the night? And maybe most unsettling of all, how many other homes held stories like theirs? How many lives crossed the line society fought to keep in place? After Dr. Hammond's death, A sealed envelope was found among her things. It was marked to be opened 50 years later, but the university opened it early, fearing legal risks. A staff member who was there later said the envelope contained a single sheet of paper. It had an address in Montreal and these words: "They survived. They lived. Their descendants walk among us still." That piece of paper was reportedly taken by officials and never made public. The address, the witness claimed, led to a cemetery. Even now, the story appears occasionally in academic papers or whispered during ghost tours in Savannah's historic district. Tour guides sometimes point to a house near Reynolds Square and say that, on some April nights, a soft light can be seen drifting from room to room. Others have claimed to hear faint poetry recited, though no one can make out the words. Of course, these are stories told for effect, meant to intrigue. But one truth remains. In 1839, Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett chose each other. In a world that tried to keep them apart, they disappeared together. And maybe, just maybe, some trace of their story still waits to be found, hidden in an attic, buried beneath the dirt, or quietly passed down through generations. Their story endures not because of ghosts or drama, but because it shook the foundation of the world they lived in. It exposed how fragile those walls really were, and how far people would go to protect or tear them down. As one Harvard researcher put it, the real weight of the Thornton story isn't in the people themselves. It's in the countless others whose names we'll never know. Those who loved in silence, who crossed the line, who disappeared without a trace. Their voices were erased, their choices hidden. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Inside the pouch was a surprising discovery. 3 letters addressed to Mrs. Jane Bennett at an address in Albany, New York. They were dated between 1841 and 1843 and written in elegant handwriting, signed only with the initial G. Later research pointed to the likely author, Grace, James Bennett's mother, who was believed to have stayed in Georgia after Elizabeth and James disappeared. The letters didn't mention Savannah or the scandal directly, but they referred to a mutual friend who had moved north and was eager for updates from home. The most powerful line came from the last letter, dated December 18, 1843. "Our mutual friend asks after you often. Things here have worsened since you left. The new master is cruel. Many have been sold. I still protect the secret you gave me. Some continue to press me, but I say nothing. What you left with me is safe, just as we agreed. When my time ends, I hope to join you in a place where people live by love, not by the rules of others." These letters were more than just emotional. They suggested Grace may have escaped north as well, contradicting old records that claimed she died on the Thornton plantation in 1840. They also revealed a secret channel of communication between Georgia and New York, one that seemed to defy the efforts to erase Elizabeth and James from history. More evidence of this underground network turned up in 1959 when a historian studying the Underground Railroad found financial records belonging to Samuel Cooper, the Philadelphia lawyer who had helped Elizabeth and James get married. The account books, discovered in a Quaker Meeting House archive in Pennsylvania, had coded entries. One from June 5, 1839 read, "Special arrangement for TMB package delivered safely to Montreal. Additional funds released as agreed for 5 years of protection and silence." Dr. Marcus Williams, who reviewed the records before they were locked away from public access in 1962, wrote in his notes, "This was no spontaneous escape. It was a carefully planned operation, years in the making. The funding, resources, and secrecy all point to long-term preparation. We must ask, did Elizabeth Thornton begin planning her exit while her husband was still alive?" That question became even more intriguing in 1964, when workers demolishing an old rice mill near the Thornton estate found a hidden compartment under the floor. Inside was a wooden box filled with what looked like school supplies, a primer, a slate pencils, and a copy of Byron's poetry collection. Experts dated the materials to the 1820s or early 1830s, long before Richard Thornton's death. Most striking was a small notebook used for handwriting practice. On one page, a single sentence was written over and over in slowly improving script. "I am James Bennett. I am a man. I have a mind." Below that, in a different handwriting believed to be Elizabeth's, were the words, Excellent progress. You have earned your name today. The evidence pointed to secret lessons. Elizabeth teaching James to read and write in private while her husband was still alive. The rice mill, which plantation records say was barely used after 1825, would have been the perfect place. Far enough from the main house to go unnoticed, but not so far as to raise suspicion. No records confirm exactly when or how their bond grew into something more. But a letter Elizabeth sent to her cousin in Montgomery in 1834, 2 years before Richard's death, hinted at a double life. I live 2 lives now. One the world sees, where I play the expected role. The other is made of quiet moments, private words, and thoughts I can't say out loud. That hidden life is the one that feels most real. After her husband's death, keeping that hidden life became harder. As a widow, Elizabeth came under closer watch, especially in how she managed the estate and the people she now fully owned. Neighbors began to notice her acting differently. One of them, Margaret Williams, wrote in her diary after visiting Elizabeth in September 1836. She's not the same. There's an energy about her, too lively for someone still in mourning. I said it must be hard running such a large place alone, and she smiled in a way I can't describe. I'm not as alone as you might think, she told me. It gave me chills. Around that time, James Bennett's role in the household also shifted. Witnesses later recalled that by early 1838, he was handling tasks far beyond what was usual. Sarah Johnson, the kitchen maid, said James was now managing the plantation's finances, welcoming guests when Elizabeth wasn't available, and even handling correspondence with merchants. He sat at the master's desk, she said, used the master's pen, spoke with the master's voice. And Mrs. Elizabeth? She just smiled, like she knew exactly what she was doing. It seemed natural. These changes didn't go unnoticed. Southern society was built on strict lines. Elizabeth and James were quietly crossing them. Then came William Thornton's sudden visit in January 1839. We still don't know exactly what he saw, but in a letter to Judge Henry Thornton afterward, William called it a disturbance of natural order. He said he had to leave immediately, afraid of what he might do if he stayed. He didn't give details, but made it clear. What he witnessed left no room for doubt. What happened next set everything in motion. Elizabeth began selling off assets and moving her money. Records show that from late January to mid-March 1839, she withdrew large sums from the Bank of Savannah, converting them into portable currency like banknotes and letters of credit. She also sold several pieces of jewelry through a broker in Charleston, and she transferred ownership of a small property she had inherited in Philadelphia to a company controlled solely by Samuel Cooper. This wasn't a spontaneous escape. It was a calculated exit strategy. In 1841, a former print shop clerk gave testimony during a legal dispute over the Thornton estate. He said that in February 1839, a well-dressed black man, later identified as James Bennett, had ordered business cards and stationery under the name James Bennett, importer of fine teas and spices with a Montreal address. Bennett claimed he was doing it for his employer, expanding business to the north. At the time, the clerk thought nothing of it, but later, when the scandal hit the newspapers, he realized what it meant. These weren't just props. They were the beginning of a new life, one where James was not a servant, but a businessman. Not someone owned, but someone respected. Montreal was a smart choice. As part of British Canada, it wasn't bound by U.S. slavery laws. It was a diverse city, large enough for them to blend in, and perfect for launching a small trading business like the one they planned. We don't know every detail of their journey north, but fragments have surfaced. It seems they traveled by ship to Philadelphia, where Cooper gave them shelter and new papers. Then they made their way through New York and into Canada. Among Cooper's effects was a receipt for a voyage aboard the schooner Mary Jane, leaving Savannah for Philadelphia on April 12, 1839. The passengers were listed as Mrs. E. Smith and Mr. J. Smith, described as aunt and nephew traveling on family business. By August of that year, a woman matching Elizabeth's description tried to access funds in Montreal. That same year, local directories listed a James Bennett, importer, with a shop on Rue St. Paul and a home on Rue Antoine. The next year, a Mrs. Jane Bennett appeared at the same address. Their race wasn't noted. Their past wasn't questioned. They had made it. Living in Montreal came with its own challenges. They had to stay in character. Elizabeth's southern accent, their appearances, their behavior, all had to match the lives they had created. Running a business required more than just paperwork. It required convincing the world they belonged. And somehow they pulled it off. Port records show Bennett's tea and spice business stayed active throughout the 1840s. Tax documents show slow, steady growth. By 1845, they had upgraded to a larger storefront. Church records from a small Methodist congregation show that Mr. and Mrs. Bennett were regular attendees and donors, described as a couple of mixed background, just vague enough to avoid attention. In 1840s Montreal, Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett quietly built a new life. A diary from their former employee, Marie LeBlanc, described him as kind, devoted, and cautious, especially when outsiders asked questions. In 1849, they disappeared from records, possibly after James's death. In 1852, Elizabeth, now Jane Bennett, bought a home later inherited by a girl named Grace, likely their daughter. Elizabeth died in 1869. Their graves were lost during city development. All that remains are letters, artifacts, and whispers of love that cross forbidden lines. Their story endures as a quiet act of resistance, dignity, and enduring hope.